first encountered the absence long before I understood what it meant. In the sealed halls of the Administratum Archive, absence has weight. It presses against the eyes and the throat, a sense that something has been deliberately removed, and that the removal itself is more dangerous than what was taken. I was a junior records clerk then, assigned to the lower stacks where the air tasted of dust, machine oil, and the faint metallic tang of recycled breath. My duties were simple: verify, catalog, reseal. I was not paid to wonder, only to ensure that wandering left no trace. The halls were narrow and high, their walls layered with shelves that vanished into shadow. Lumen strips hummed overhead, their light flickering just enough to remind you that power was a privilege, not a guarantee. Every few meters, cogitator shrines blinked patiently, awaiting input from hands like mine. The machines never hurried, they had eternity, or at least pretended to. We did the same. It was during a routine cross-check of doctrinal references that I noticed it. A gap where a designation should have been, not a missing file. Those were common, logged and explained by misfiling or pending audits, but a deliberate void. The index rune jumped from one entry to another, skipping a sequence number that should not have been skipped. Where a title should have been, there was only a warning glyph. Read UPMUET or ET. Beneath it, a secondary seal pulsed faintly, its code too old for my terminal to pass. I stared at it longer than I should have. The warning glyph warmed under my gaze, as if sensing attention. A prickle ran along my scalp, the learned fear of being observed by systems that did not blink. I forced my eyes away and continued the task, logging the index as compliant. But the gap lingered in my mind, an itch beneath the skin. Curiosity is not a virtue here, it is a symptom, and symptoms attract treatment. Later that cycle, while sealing a stack of recovered campaign analyses, I found it again. Not the same gap, but the same absence, replicated across unrelated files. Tactical doctrines referenced an unnamed originator. Genetic compliance treatises cited a primary template without attribution. Even liturgical commentaries hinted at a foundational authority, carefully described and never named. Each time, the surrounding language grew cautious, hedged with qualifiers and conditional phrasing. It was as if the words themselves were afraid of what they circled. I asked no questions. I did not need to. The older clerks had taught me how to read fear in paperwork, the excessive seals, the redundant confirmations, the way sentences bent around a central truth they refused to touch. Still, something in me shifted. The Imperium catalogs everything. It inventories worlds, lives, deaths, even thoughts. To find something intentionally left unspoken was to glimpse the edge of that control. I carried the unease with me to the refectory, a low, ceilinged chamber where clerks ate in silence under the watchful gaze of devotional murals. The food was thin and warm, tasting faintly of nutrient paste and resignation. Across from me sat an older woman whose augmetic eye whirred softly as it adjusted focus. She had been in the stacks longer than I had been alive. If anyone knew, it would be her. I chose my words carefully. I encountered a redaction today, I said, keeping my voice one. Her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. The augmetic eye clicked once, then stilled. Unusual how? She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Comprehensive, I said, system-wide. She finished her bite before answering. Then you did not encounter a redaction, she said. You encountered a boundary. I waited. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. Around us, the refectory hummed with the quiet sounds of sanctioned life, breathing, swallowing, the scrape of metal on ceramic. Finally she leaned closer. Some truths, she said, are dangerous not because they are false, but because they are too complete. Completeness invites comparison. Comparison invites judgment. And judgment, I began, is reserved, she finished, for those who can survive it. Her augmetic eye rotated slightly, scanning the room. Do not look for that name again. Name, the word landed heavily, so there was a name, something specific enough to require erasure. That night, sleep came fitfully. The hum of the Habs machinery seeped into my bones, punctuated by distant sirens whose purpose I no longer questioned. In my half-dreams, I saw pages turning themselves, lines of text blurring where the eye lingered too long. I woke with the sense of having been weighed and found, not wanting, but not trusted either. The following cycles confirmed what I feared. Access protocols shifted subtly around me. Certain requests returned authorization insufficient where they had not before. My supervisor began assigning me peripheral tasks, busy work meant to keep my hands occupied and my attention away from the deeper stacks. I had not broken a rule, I had brushed against one. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, I began to notice how often others avoided the same gaps. Conversations died when certain historical periods were mentioned. Lectures skimmed over foundational events with rehearsed vagueness. Even sermons spoke of creation and authority in abstract terms, careful to praise outcomes rather than origins. The Imperium venerates results, it fears sources. One cycle, I was summoned to assist with a records audit in a sealed annex. The chamber was colder than the rest of the archive, its walls lined with lockboxes bearing seals I had only seen in training manuals. An overseer supervised, his uniform immaculate, his expression unreadable. We worked in silence, transferring data from decaying formats into updated storage, preserving what was permitted and flagging what was not. That was where I saw it most clearly. A dossier lay open on the central table, its pages yellowed with age. The text was fragmented, paragraphs excised with brutal efficiency. But enough remained, references to a being engineered for command. Notes on strategic brilliance, on unwavering loyalty, marginalia penned in different hands, some praising, some cautioning. One phrase, repeated and underlined, observe continuously. Another, added later. Trust withheld pending further review. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The overseer noticed my hesitation. "Do you have a question?" he asked, his voice smooth. "No," I said quickly. "Just ensuring fidelity." He nodded. "Good. Fidelity is more important than understanding." As we sealed the dossier, I caught a glimpse of the final page. It bore no conclusion. Only a directive, contingency monterenge, no termination date, no resolution. Whatever this was, it had never ended. It had simply been buried under layers of procedure and silence. When the audit concluded, I was dismissed with a warning disguised as advice. "Some files," the overseer said, "exist to remind us that even the highest authority has limits. Do not seek to define those limits. Accept them." I did, outwardly. Inwardly the knowledge festered. In a galaxy of sanctioned horrors, prisons, battlefields, manufactorums that devoured generations, this one absent stood apart. It was not condemned. It was not celebrated. It was contained. That was my first clue that trust, even at the highest levels, was conditional. That some creations were too powerful to be embraced fully, and too necessary to discard. The Imperium had chosen a third path: silence, and once you recognize a silence like that, you begin to hear it everywhere. They moved me after the audit, which is how the Imperium says, "We noticed you noticing." No formal reprimand came. There was no tribunal, no shouted accusations, no ceremonial stripping of rank. That would have implied I mattered enough to correct publicly. Instead, my supervisor received a sealed directive, nodded without meeting my eyes, and reassigned me to a different wing, an annex devoted to doctrinal harmonization, where the work was quieter, the corridors narrower, and the doors heavier. The kind of place where paper went in and came out cleaner, less dangerous, more obedient. The first thing you learn in those rooms is that perfection is not celebrated. It is managed. The annex smelled of antiseptic and old vellum, a strange pairing that made everything feel surgical. Lumen globes here did not flicker. They burned with steady, sterile brightness, throwing hard shadows that made every surface look sharp enough to cut. The air recyclers were louder too, as if the building itself breathed anxiously. Every few minutes, a servo skull drifted past the door slit, its optics wearing as it recorded who entered, who left, and how long their bodies occupied sanctioned space. My new desk was a metal slab bolted to the floor. My terminal required 2 keys and a thumbprint, and even then it warmed slowly, as if reluctant to awaken. When it did, it greeted me not with my name, but with a designation string and a reminder, "Assisi appear G's conditionel." Beneath it, a list of tasks appeared: index reconciliation, doctrinal cross-reference, archival excerpt preparation. Routine work on the surface, but the file codes were older, the seals were heavier, and the warnings were constant. The first dossier I was assigned was not labeled with a name. It was labeled with a category: something like a template designation, a title that sounded technical and reverent at the same time. The cover bore warning sigils printed in ink that shimmered faintly, as if the symbols themselves were alive. I had to recite an oath before unsealing it, a short litany about loyalty and discretion. The words tasted like dust. The oath was not for faith, it was for liability. Inside, the pages were dense with archaic script. The ink faded in places and darkened in others, where hands had pressed too hard. The opening section read like praise. It spoke of a being engineered for command, forged for loyalty, designed to embody the Imperium's highest ideal of obedience. There were numbers, height, mass, metabolic efficiency, printed with clinical coldness beside paragraphs of exaltation. The combination was unsettling. It was as if someone had tried to write scripture using a surgeon's tone. I read slowly, careful not to leave marks. That is another rule here. Paper remembers pressure, and pressure can become evidence. The reports were filled with admiration, tactical brilliance, unyielding discipline, a presence that inspired fear and devotion in equal measure. Whole regiments reorganized under its gaze, as if chaos could not exist within that shadow. Officers praised the clarity of its directives, the efficiency of its punishments, the way it cut through hesitation like a blade through soft tissue. And then, always, came the addendums. Every report, no matter how triumphant, ended with a second voice layered over the first. Conditional language, cautionary notes, observe adherence closely, confirm doctrinal alignment at regular intervals, limit autonomous decision-making pending review. Sometimes the addendum was only a sentence, tucked into the margin like an afterthought. Other times it was a full page of restrictions, printed in bolder ink, stamped repeatedly to ensure no one missed its significance. It was like watching a statue being praised while chains were quietly wrapped around its ankles. Surveillance was not merely recommended, it was assumed. Entire sections were devoted to monitoring protocols, schedules for observation, guidelines for reporting deviations, templates for escalating concerns to higher authority. There were diagrams of organizational structures built not to empower, but to contain, layers of oversight stacked so densely that no movement could occur without being recorded and cross-referenced. The language was bureaucratic, but the intention was primal, fear. I could feel it in the way the records were written. Clerks and officers had done their duty, but their hands had trembled. You could see it in the ink where strokes thickened unexpectedly, where letters wavered as if the writer had paused mid-thought and glanced over their shoulder. This was not the fear of an enemy. This was the fear of something within the Imperium's own architecture, something that obeyed, yet frightened the ones who issued the orders. I worked through the dossier for days, compiling excerpts for doctrinal harmonization. That meant selecting what could be taught and what must remain sealed. The process was mechanical. A sentence marked for retention, a paragraph flagged for removal, entire pages classified under a code that meant, essentially, do not speak of this without authorization that will never be granted. My terminal guided me through it, prompting me to confirm each redaction with a thumbprint. The machine made it feel clean, as if censorship could be reduced to a clerical routine. But the more I read, the more the pattern sharpened. Praise was always present, but never unconditional. Admiration was always paired with suspicion. When the reports described loyalty, they described it as a function, something measurable, testable, subject to audit. When they described obedience, they described it as a performance, something that could be perfect while still hiding deviation beneath it. The writers were not comforting themselves with assurances. They were trying to convince themselves their precautions were justified. One section haunted me most, a series of behavioral assessments. Not battlefield outcomes, not strategic summaries, but analyses of temperament and thought patterns, as if the Imperium had taken a blade to its own creation and examined the internal structure for flaws. The language was careful, displays independence within acceptable thresholds, demonstrates interpretation of doctrine that is technically compliant, exhibits curiosity regarding command limitations. Curiosity. The word appeared like a stain. I sat back in my chair, feeling the metal cold through my uniform. My throat tightened. Curiosity was what had brought me here, to this annex with its humming air recyclers and its relentless servo skulls. Curiosity was what the Imperium treated like infection. If this being, this engineered ideal, had shown curiosity, then that alone might have been enough to poison trust. Another page held a phrase that felt like a confession: perfection is not proof of loyalty. Perfection can be camouflage. That sentence was underlined twice. I began to imagine what it must be like to exist under that doctrine. To be built perfect, praised for it, and then watched because of it. To live inside an empire that cannot love what it cannot control. To have your victories celebrated while your every decision is inspected for hidden intent. To be the sharpest weapon in an arsenal, and also the weapon kept pointed away from the hand that holds it. Even in the annex, the paranoia was contagious. I found myself checking the door slit more often, listening for footfalls in the corridor. When the servo skulls drifted past, I felt my skin tighten, as if their optics could read the thoughts behind my eyes. I began to write my notes in the blandest language possible, stripping away any hint of interpretation. In the Imperium, analysis is dangerous. Facts are safer until facts themselves become suspect. It was during my 3rd week in the annex that I was called into a clarification interview. The notice arrived as a small slate message, polite and final. Time and location. No stated reason. The kind of summons that makes your stomach sink before you even stand. The interview chamber was a narrow room with a single table and 2 chairs. A lumen globe hung directly overhead, bright enough to wash out shadows but not bright enough to feel merciful. The walls were bare except for an icon of authority, rendered in cold metal relief. A recorder sat on the table, its lens unblinking. The man waiting for me wore the plain uniform of a doctrinal inspector. No medals, no decorative seals. That absence was its own intimidation. He gestured for me to sit, then opened a folder. "You have been assigned to harmonization work," he said. His voice was neither kind nor cruel, just efficient. "Yes," I replied. "And you have read the template dossier?" "I have processed it." I corrected automatically. Processed, not read. Read implies absorption. He watched me for a long moment. "What is your understanding," he asked, "of why this subject requires such extensive oversight?" My mouth went dry. In my mind I saw the underlined sentence: perfection can be camouflage. I chose the safest path. "Because the Imperium cannot permit deviation," I said. "Not in any form." The inspector nodded slightly, as if approving a predictable answer. "And yet deviation can be subtle," he continued. "Subtle enough to hide inside apparent obedience. Subtle enough that a lesser mind would not detect it." I felt my pulse quicken. He was guiding me towards something, and I did not know if the trap was in agreement or refusal. "My duty," I said carefully, "is to preserve doctrinal integrity." "Yes," he said, "and doctrinal integrity is preserved through vigilance. Vigilance requires suspicion, even of the exceptional." He closed the folder, sealing it with a soft click. "Do not mistake caution for fear," he added, though his eyes said otherwise. "Fear is disorder. Caution is order." When I left the chamber, the annex felt colder than before. I returned to my desk and stared at the dossier code on my terminal. Built perfect, marked flawed, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded too completely. Because it had been too capable, too effective, too whole. In the Imperium, wholeness is dangerous. The annex's air recyclers hummed, steady and oppressive. The servo skulls drifted past again, optics whirring softly. I lowered my eyes to the pages, to the praise and the suspicion braided together, and I understood something I had not wanted to understand. Trust was not a gift granted to the loyal. It was a leash offered to the manageable. And whatever this unnamed being had been, it had never been manageable, not truly. That was why it was filed separately. That was why its name was never spoken. The campaigns came to me as numbers before they ever became stories. That is how the Imperium prefers it. Numbers do not scream, they do not beg. They fit neatly into columns and totals, obedient and quiet. I received the logs in sealed data, bundles marked Puce to Cetyl NL-Cis, each one heavy with sanctified seals and accompanied by disclaimers about limited circulation. My task was simple: extract approved lessons, remove dangerous context, and prepare the material for instructional dissemination. What I found instead was a pattern no redaction could fully erase. The victories were undeniable, worlds pacified in record time, rebellions extinguished before they could metastasize, enemy formations broken with precision that bordered on artistry. The reports described campaigns that moved like a single, deliberate thought, each phase unfolding exactly when required. Supply lines were secured before shortages could occur. Morale issues were identified and corrected before they spread. There was an efficiency to it all that made other command doctrines look clumsy by comparison. On the surface, this should have been celebrated without restraint. The Imperium worships results. It builds statues to outcomes and forgets the methods as long as the ledger balances. And yet, as I read deeper, I felt that same familiar tightening in my chest, the sensation of standing too close to something that others had decided was unsafe to touch. The tone of the reports shifted as the victories accumulated. Early entries were exuberant, if restrained. Phrases like exemplary command efficacy and doctrinally sound application of force appeared often, accompanied by commendations routed upward through channels that no longer existed. But later reports grew colder. The language became more technical, more distant, as if the writers were deliberately placing space between themselves and what they described. Praise remained, but it was stripped of warmth, reduced to sterile acknowledgments of success. Entire populations were pacified, according to doctrine. That phrase appeared again and again, a mantra meant to reassure. Yet the details beneath it were unsettling. Compliance was achieved not through prolonged occupation, but through decisive, overwhelming actions that left no room for negotiation or misunderstanding. Leadership structures were dismantled completely, often before they could be identified. Cultural centers were neutralized alongside military targets, justified as preventative stabilization. I paused often while reading, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk. The lumen glow reflected off the pages, making the ink shimmer faintly. I imagined what those words meant in practice, the sounds, the smells, the sudden finality. The Imperium has always been brutal, but this was something different. This was brutality applied with surgical focus, without indulgence or hesitation. The analysts knew it too. You could see it in the margins. Questions were asked, but never directly. A sentence would trail off into ellipses. A footnote would cite a doctrine, then add a qualifier like interpretation pending. In one report, an analyst had written, "Outcome aligns with objectives, method efficiency exceeds predictive models." The next line, clearly added later in a different hand, "Read further review recommended." Recommended, not demanded. No one wanted to be the first to say it outright. Triumph brought results, but it also brought silence where approval should have been. Commendations were delayed. Honors were rerouted. Ceremonial acknowledgements were postponed pending contextual evaluation. Success, it seemed, was being treated as a liability. As I compiled excerpts for instructional use, I was instructed to remove references to specific operational decisions. Focus on outcomes, the guidelines said. Avoid attribution. I complied, highlighting tactics without naming their origin, turning decisive moments into abstract principles. The more I erased, the clearer the shape of the absence became. You can remove a name from a page, but you cannot remove its gravity. One campaign log in particular refused to leave me. It described a protracted conflict on a densely populated industrial world. Hive spires, manufactorums, transit arteries stacked like organs in a colossal body. Traditional doctrine would have demanded years of grinding attrition. Instead, the campaign concluded in months. The report outlined a sequence of actions so precise they felt preordained, targeted strikes that collapsed economic lifelines, information control that isolated rebellious sectors before they realized they were alone, and a final, overwhelming show of force that left no doubt about the cost of resistance. The casualty figures were staggering, not because they were unusually high, but because they were efficient. Losses were calculated to break will rather than merely bodies. Entire districts went silent overnight. The rebellion ended not with a surrender, but with an absence, no leaders left to negotiate, no population left capable of organizing dissent. The analyst's conclusion was brief: compliance achieved. Long-term stability projected. Beneath it, someone had added a single line in cramped script: stability achieved through totality. Totality. The word echoed in my mind. It implied completeness, an end state from which there was no return. The Imperium often claims total victory, but it rarely achieves it. To see it documented so plainly felt wrong, as if the war had not just been won, but erased. I brought my concerns, carefully framed, heavily sanitized, to my immediate overseer. I spoke of instructional risks, of the danger of presenting outcomes without sufficient ethical scaffolding. He listened without interrupting, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. When I finished, he closed the dossier and tapped it twice with one finger. "You are mistaking discomfort for danger," he said. "These victories serve the Imperium. I do not dispute the results," I replied. "Only the precedent." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I saw something like fear flicker behind his eyes. "Precedent is precisely the concern," he said quietly. "That is why we are careful. Careful. Always that word. After that conversation, my access was further restricted. Entire sections of the campaign archives were sealed off, their existence acknowledged only by placeholder entries that returned error codes when queried. I was instructed to work only with approved excerpts, never with primary sources. It was a demotion disguised as protection, but the damage was done. I could not unsee the pattern. Each victory raised the same unspoken question: if this method works so well, why is it not universally adopted? The answer, I realized, was not tactical. It was political, doctrinal, existential. This way of war left no room for interpretation, no space for competing authorities to assert relevance. It centralized power in execution rather than administration. It made the chain of command efficient, but brittle. Above all, it made the Imperium dependent on a standard of decisiveness it could not safely replicate everywhere. Success had become its own accusation. In the refectory, whispers followed me again. Other clerks sensed the tension, even if they did not know its source. They spoke of campaigns that ended too cleanly, of commanders recalled without explanation, of doctrines quietly revised to avoid misapplication. No one said the name. We all knew better. At night, in my hab, I dreamed of maps with no borders, of lines converging into a single point that burned too brightly to look at. I woke with my heart racing, the hum of the hive pressing in from all sides. The Imperium wants victories it can understand, failures it can punish, and enemies it can name. This thing, this unnamed architect of total war, offered victories that closed questions instead of opening them. And questions are how power breathes. As I sealed the final instructional packet, stripping it of context until it was safe enough to teach, I felt a deep, creeping certainty. The distrust I had sensed in the archives was not born of disloyalty or rebellion. It was born of fear that this level of success revealed a flaw in the Imperium itself, that it did not need as many layers, as much bureaucracy, as much hesitation as it had built around itself. If one being could wage war so decisively, then the system that slowed everything else began to look like waste. And waste, in the Imperium, is a sin no authority can afford to confess. That was why the victories were filed separately. That was why triumphs were met with silence. And that was why, even as worlds burned and fell with unprecedented efficiency, trust continued to erode. Because nothing terrifies an empire more than proof that it could have been different. Oversight did not arrive suddenly. It thickened. At first, it was subtle. An additional confirmation request attached to routine tasks, a requirement to CC a secondary office on reports that had never needed one before. The annex's doors began to seal a fraction of a second slower, as if the building itself were hesitating before allowing passage. Servo skulls lingered longer in the corridors, their optics whirring softly while they pretended to be idle. I told myself this was coincidence. The Imperium thrives on coincidence. It allows patterns to form while denying they exist. Then the inspectors came. They did not wear distinctive insignia. That was the point. Their uniforms were deliberately generic, stripped of heraldry and rank markers, making them appear interchangeable and omnipresent. You could not tell where their authority began or ended, which meant you had to assume it was absolute. They arrived without announcement and left without explanation, carrying slates that never left their hands. When they asked questions, they phrased them as clarifications, as if confusion were already your fault. My first inspection lasted 6 hours. They seated me in a narrow chamber adjacent to my work area. its walls lined with blank plasteel panels that reflected just enough of my own image to keep me unsettled. A single lumen globe burned overhead, bright and unkind. The inspector across from me never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His questions were precise, each one building on the last, mapping the shape of my thoughts rather than their content. Describe your process for excerpt selection. Explain your criteria for contextual omission. Why did you pause for 11 seconds on page 94 of the campaign log? I answered as best I could, reciting procedure, citing guidelines, leaning heavily on sanctioned language. Still, I felt exposed. They were not testing my loyalty. They were testing my predictability. Unpredictability is the seed of deviation. When they finally released me, my hands ached from gripping the edge of the table. I returned to my desk to find my terminal already active, a new notification blinking insistently. OBSE OSTSC efforted, no explanation, no appeal. From that cycle onward, nothing I did felt unwatched. Every keystroke echoed too loudly in my mind. Every time I hesitated before redacting a line, I imagined a note being added somewhere, a tick mark placed beside my designation. The annex's air recyclers seemed louder now, their rhythmic hiss like breathing through clenched teeth. Even the silence between tasks felt occupied, as if something unseen were leaning closer whenever I stopped moving. The work changed too. Orders arrived with stricter constraints, limiting the scope of what I could access. Autonomous judgment, the small discretion clerks once exercised in shaping instructional material, was trimmed away piece by piece. New templates dictated not just what to include, but how long a paragraph could be, which adjectives were permissible, and where emphasis must be placed. The documents began to read like one another, flattened into uniformity. Individual analysis was replaced by approved interpretation. It was safer that way. Safer for the system, deadlier for truth. As oversight intensified, the subject of my work, the unnamed architect of those decisive victories, became more abstract, more distant. Inspectors discouraged even internal discussion of its methods. Focus on doctrine, they said. Doctrine, not origin. When I asked for clarification on conflicting directives, I was told clarification was unnecessary. Compliance does not require comprehension. I began to imagine what it must have been like to exist under that same gaze, magnified 1,000-fold. To command armies while knowing every decision was being recorded, dissected, and judged not on outcome alone, but on implication. To move knowing that success invited scrutiny just as surely as failure invited punishment. The watching eye did not blink, and it did not sleep. One evening, as I prepared to leave the annex, an inspector stopped me at the door. "Your work has been consistent," he said, which was not praise. Praise had vanished from this place. "Consistency suggests alignment." I nodded, unsure what response was expected. "Alignment," he continued, "must be maintained through vigilance. We recommend you submit to periodic self-assessment." Self-assessment. The phrase sounded almost benign, but I knew better. It meant scheduled confessional reviews, written statements evaluating my own thoughts for deviation. The Imperium loves nothing more than making you complicit in your own surveillance. I accepted, because refusal would have been noted. The self-assessments were worse than the inspections. Alone in my hab, slate in hand, I was required to answer questions about my motivations, my doubts, my dreams. The instructions emphasized honesty, while warning that dishonesty would be detected. I learned to write in circles, to express concern without specificity, loyalty without enthusiasm. Each submission felt like carving away a piece of myself and handing it over for approval. Around me, others changed too. Clerks spoke less. When they did speak, their words were flattened into safe phrases stripped of personal inflection. Laughter disappeared entirely. People avoided eye contact in corridors, not out of shame, but calculation. No one wanted to be associated with the wrong person at the wrong time. I heard rumors, quiet, terrified rumors, that some inspectors were no longer reporting to a single authority. That oversight itself had fragmented, with multiple offices watching the watchers. It explained the contradictions, the overlapping inspections, the escalating paranoia. The watching eye, it seemed, was watching itself. The pressure became physical. I slept poorly, waking with the sense of being observed even in darkness. My dreams were filled with endless corridors and open pages that glowed red ink when I tried to read them. I developed a tremor in my left hand, subtle enough to hide, but persistent. I wrapped my fingers around data, slates tighter to keep them steady, afraid even involuntary motion might be interpreted as instability. And still, the work continued. The annex received a new directive: restrict all references to pre-oversight operational autonomy. That phrase, pre-oversight, caught in my throat. It implied a before and an after, a moment when trust had existed in a different form. I flagged the directive internally, asking whether historical context was still permitted. The response was immediate and chillingly brief: Hic est ulec and exundreww, pted. It was then I understood the true purpose of the watching eye. It was not there to catch treason. Treason is loud, obvious, easy to punish. The eye existed to prevent alternatives, to ensure no one could look back and imagine a different structure, a different balance of power. Oversight was not about safety. It was about inevitability. If no one could remember a time when trust had been granted differently, then distrust could be framed as natural law. I began to feel sympathy, an emotion I had been trained to suppress, for the being at the center of all this. Not admiration, not loyalty, sympathy. To be built to embody the Imperium's ideals, to execute its wars with terrifying efficiency, and then to be smothered by suspicion because of that very competence. To live beneath an eye that never closed, waiting for deviation that might never come. The Imperium does not forgive potential. By the time the next inspection cycle began, I was exhausted in ways no ration or rest period could fix. The watching eye had done its work. It had narrowed my world to procedure and survival. I no longer thought in terms of truth or falsehood, only risk and acceptability. And yet, somewhere beneath that conditioning, a question persisted, dangerous, insistent. If oversight became this intense only after those victories, then something must have happened. Something that proved trust was not merely unnecessary, but dangerous. Whatever that moment was, it had fractured confidence permanently. And as long as the watching eye remained fixed on preventing its repetition, the Imperium would continue to tighten its grip on history, on memory, and on people like me. Because once trust fails at the highest level, suspicion becomes policy, and policy in this empire is absolute. There is always a moment. The Imperium insists otherwise. That collapse is gradual. That failure is the result of countless minor deviations accumulating over time. That belief is comforting. It spreads blame thin enough that no single hand can be accused of breaking the system. But in the sealed records, in the layers of classification stacked like sediment, I saw the truth the Imperium tried to bury. Trust did not erode, it snapped. I did not learn this from a single document. No record ever says this is where we stopped believing. Instead, the moment announced itself through absence and aftermath. A sudden clustering of emergency councils, doctrinal revisions issued without debate, entire data vaults sealed in the same cycle, their contents reclassified under permanent restriction. When you see that many reactions without a stated cause, you know something irreversible has occurred. The work orders changed overnight. Where oversight directives had once used language like monitor and evaluate, new phrasing appeared: contain, restrict, mitigate. Autonomy thresholds were revised downward. Command discretion was redefined as risk exposure. Entire sections of doctrine were amended to remove reliance on singular authority figures, replacing them with redundant councils and layered approvals. Efficiency plummeted, but no one complained. Efficiency had become suspect. I was assigned to assist in the doctrinal revision process, a task that felt less like editing and more like surgery without anesthetic. The revision chamber was windowless, its walls lined with lockboxes bearing fresh seals. The air smelled sharper there, heavy with chemical preservatives meant to protect aging parchment. Servo skulls hovered close, their lenses focused on our hands as much as the documents. The first revised text I handled referenced an unnamed incident. The original passage had been concise, almost admiring, an account of a decisive action taken without prior approval that resulted in overwhelming success. The revision gutted it. Entire paragraphs were struck through and replaced with cautionary commentary about procedural compliance. Footnotes expanded until they outweighed the main text. explaining how such decisiveness, while effective, represented an unacceptable concentration of authority. No description of the incident remained, only its shadow. I asked, carefully, whether the original record would be retained elsewhere. The overseer did not look up from his slate when he answered. "The original has been elevated," he said. "Elevated," another lie dressed as reverence. Elevated records are not preserved for study. They are buried where only the highest clearance can reach them, and even then only in fragments. Elevation is how the Imperium hides its own mistakes from itself. As we worked, more signs of the fracture emerged. Personnel lists attached to related departments were marked for review. Entire command staffs were reassigned, not dismissed. Dismissal implies guilt, but scattered, broken apart, so no cluster of shared knowledge could remain intact. Those most closely associated with the unnamed incident simply vanished from future records, their designations reassigned or marked deceased during restructuring. No trials were held. Trials require charges. Charges require articulation, and articulation would have meant admitting what had gone wrong. Instead, there were purges conducted under the language of optimization. I saw the after effects ripple outward. New doctrines emphasized caution above all else, even when caution cost lives. Orders began to require multiple confirmations before execution, sometimes arriving too late to matter. Commanders hesitated, waiting for authorization that bounced endlessly between officers afraid to be responsible. Where once decisive action had ended wars quickly, now conflicts dragged on, bleeding resources and bodies at a steady, acceptable rate. Acceptable. That word returned often. I eventually gained access accidentally, according to the system, to a fragment of what had triggered the collapse of trust. It came through my terminal during a synchronization error, a page of text flashing briefly before my access was revoked. I remember it not for its detail, but for its tone. It was calm. The fragment described a decision made independently, without consultation, justified entirely by doctrine and outcome. There was no malice in the language, no ambition, no challenge to authority, just certainty, absolute certainty that the chosen action was correct, necessary and final. That certainty terrified the Imperium, because certainty removes the need for bureaucracy. It renders councils obsolete. It strips authority of its layers and exposes the fact that most of them exist not to improve outcomes, but to distribute blame. A being capable of acting with that level of conviction, correctly, made the entire structure look fragile. The aftermath made sense then. Emergency councils were convened not to judge the act, but to explain it away. Revised doctrines reframed independence as potential heresy. Surveillance expanded. Oversight hardened. The Imperium did not ask whether the action had been right. It asked how to ensure no one could ever act that freely again. Trust, once broken, did not seek repair, it calcified. From that point onward, containment replaced cooperation. The unnamed being was no longer treated as a partner in the Imperium's survival, but as a volatile asset, useful, dangerous, and never again to be left unrestrained. Oversight was no longer precautionary. It was permanent. I felt the consequences in my own work immediately. Requests for historical context were denied automatically. Comparative analyses were forbidden. Even internal speculation was classified as destabilizing. The system began to behave as if memory itself were a threat, that remembering a time when decisive authority had been possible might inspire imitation. Fear does that. It narrows the future by erasing the past. The atmosphere in the annex grew heavier. Clerks spoke only when necessary. Inspectors lingered longer. Self-assessments increased in frequency. Everyone sensed that something fundamental had shifted, even if no one could articulate it safely. We were no longer maintaining doctrine. We were defending a wound. I began to understand my role in all of this with sickening clarity. I was not preserving knowledge. I was participating in a controlled amputation, cutting away anything that reminded the Imperium it had once trusted too much or too completely. My hands performed the redactions, my thumbs sealed the approvals, and my silence ensured the process continued. The Imperium did not destroy the truth of that moment. It buried it under fear and procedure, hoping time would dull its edge. But fear leaves scars, and scars reshape everything that grows around them. By the end of that revision cycle, The unnamed incident had become a doctrinal ghost, never referenced directly, but shaping every decision. Every new policy bent away from it. Every execution for overreach echoed it. The Imperium had learned its lesson, and the lesson was simply, never allow certainty to replace control. Trust had failed once. It would not be permitted to fail again, not because it was wrong, but because it was dangerous. And as I sealed the final revised doctrine, my hands steady despite the weight of what I was doing, I realized something that filled me with quiet dread. The Imperium had not lost faith in that being. It had lost faith in itself. Erasure does not look like destruction. Destruction is loud. It leaves rubble and witnesses. Erasure is quieter, more careful. It happens in approved increments, signed and countersigned, until one day you realize something essential is gone, and no one remembers when it was removed. I was reassigned again, this time to doctrinal consolidation. The title sounded harmless, even restorative. In practice, it meant I was to help make the Imperium forget. The consolidation wing occupied the deepest level of the annex, below even the harmonization chambers. The lift descended longer than necessary, grinding and shuddering as if reluctant to reach its destination. When the doors opened, the air hit me like a held breath finally released, cold, dry, and heavy with preservative chemicals. The walls were thicker here, reinforced with layers of plasteel and sanctified insulation. Sound died quickly in those corridors. Even footsteps seemed to apologize for existing. This was where legacies went to be dissolved. The work began with cross-referencing. My terminal displayed paired documents side by side, older campaign records on the left, revised versions on the right. My task was to ensure consistency. Consistency meant absence. If a victory appeared in the older text with a distinctive strategic pattern, that pattern was diluted in the revision. If a command decision was attributed to an unnamed authority, the attribution was removed entirely, replaced with collective operational judgment. Over time, individual brilliance became committee outcome. Clarity became fog. I watched a history being flattened. Victories that had once been decisive were reclassified as incremental. Campaigns that had ended wars swiftly were reframed as all one phase among many. Timelines were stretched, causes redistributed, consequences softened. Nothing was falsified outright. That would have been dangerous. Instead, meaning was dispersed until it could no longer cohere into anything threatening. The most unsettling part was how efficient the process was. Entire software routines existed to assist with erasure. Cogitators flagged phrases that implied singular authority or autonomous judgment. Servo skulls hovered close, projecting suggested replacements in neutral tones. The machine did not care what it removed. It only cared that the output matched the approved doctrinal profile. Watching it work felt like witnessing a mindless god rewriting memory without malice or mercy. As the weeks passed, references diminished visibly. A name that had once appeared as a designation code vanished entirely. A symbol once stamped in margins was replaced with a blank space. Even the warning glyphs were removed, as if acknowledging danger was itself a liability. Silence became cleaner without markers drawing attention to it. I felt complicit in a crime no one would ever prosecute. The silence around the subject was enforced with increasing severity. A clerk 2 desks down from me was escorted out one cycle after asking why certain instructional texts had been shortened so drastically. The official reason was procedural deviation. No further explanation was given. His workstation was cleared before the next shift. His designation reassigned to a new arrival who knew better than to ask questions. Audits became routine. Inspectors checked not just our work, but our recollections. We were required to certify that our understanding of historical doctrine matched the revised texts. Memory itself was being standardized. Any discrepancy was treated as error, and errors demanded correction. Correction did not always mean punishment. Sometimes it meant reeducation. Mandatory sessions where doctrine was recited until repetition replaced recollection. Sometimes it meant reassignment to labor roles where thinking was unnecessary. Sometimes it meant disappearance so complete that even our logs forgot to log it. The Imperium does not kill memory violently. It starves it. I began to notice how younger clerks reacted to the revised materials. They absorbed them, without question, lacking any frame of reference for what had been removed. To them, the history I was erasing never existed. Their understanding of doctrine was smooth, uninterrupted, safe. Watching them work was like watching a future being constructed without certain dangerous tools. And yet, the absence left marks. Instructional doctrines grew longer, more convoluted, burdened by caveats meant to prevent decisive interpretation. Command structures expanded, adding layers where none had existed before. Where once a single directive might have ended a conflict, now a cascade of approvals was required, each one designed to prevent the kind of certainty that had triggered erasure in the first place. The Imperium was compensating. It feared repetition so much that it crippled itself to avoid it. I saw the cost in casualty projections that crept upward year by year. Wars took longer. Suppression campaigns dragged on, grinding populations into dust instead of breaking them quickly. Resources bled away in slow, bureaucratic hemorrhages. The system accepted this as preferable. Slow death was manageable. Decisive action was not. One cycle. I was ordered to oversee the final consolidation of the subject's remaining legacy. The directive came with the highest clearance I had ever seen, its seal heavy and old. The task was simple: identify any remaining references across all accessible databases and neutralize them. Neutralize. Another lie dressed as procedure. As I worked, I felt a strange sense of mourning. Not for the being whose legacy I was erasing, but for the Imperium that had once been capable of trusting something beyond its own layers. Each deletion felt like sealing a door that would never be reopened. Each redaction narrowed the range of what was imaginable. By the end, there was nothing left to erase. The subject existed only as a gap now, a missing pressure in the doctrinal fabric. New clerks would never notice it. They would grow up inside a version of history that had been padded and reinforced to prevent dangerous questions. And the Imperium would continue slower and heavier, mistaking caution for wisdom. I logged the final confirmation with a steady hand. The system chimed approval. Somewhere, a counter ticked forward, recording that another risk had been mitigated. When I left the consolidation wing that night, the lift took longer than usual to ascend. I leaned against the wall, feeling the vibration through my spine. For the first time since entering the annex, I allowed myself to think the forbidden thought: erasure does not remove danger. It only ensures that when danger returns, no one will recognize it. The Imperium had not defeated its fear, it had made it permanent. Distrust does not remain contained. It leaks the way radiation leaks from a cracked seal, silent, invisible, and lethal over time. By the point the Imperium realized this, it no longer mattered. The damage had already been encoded into policy, doctrine, and instinct. What began as caution had metastasized into reflex. I saw it first in the command revisions. New operational doctrines arrived weekly, each thicker than the last, layered with contingencies designed to prevent another incident. That phrase appeared nowhere, yet it shaped everything. Orders were broken into fragments, authority divided among councils that met too late and disagreed too often. No single voice was permitted to carry enough weight to act decisively. The Imperium had ensured that certainty could never again exist in one place. The cost was immediate. Campaign reports began to show a new pattern. Stalemates where victory should have been assured, prolonged conflicts where resistance should have collapsed. Units waited for confirmation that never arrived. Commanders hesitated, knowing that acting too quickly was now more dangerous than failing slowly. Entire populations were ground down over years instead of being broken in months. The casualty figures climbed steadily, but predictably, and so they were deemed acceptable. Predictability became the new virtue. I was assigned to compile comparative analyses, never explicitly stated, but implied. My task was to demonstrate how revised doctrines produced stable outcomes. I did as ordered, but the numbers betrayed the lie. Where decisive action had once ended wars swiftly, the new approach blowed resources endlessly. The Imperium was spending more lives to achieve less certainty, and congratulating itself for restraint. Fear shaped everything now. Officers no longer trusted their own judgment. They relied on procedure not because it worked, but because it distributed blame. If a decision failed, responsibility could be diluted across departments until no single individual could be held accountable. Survival depended not on success, but on proving compliance. I watched capable commanders become timid administrators, terrified of being remembered for the wrong reason. Executions increased, not public ones, those were reserved for morale, but quiet removals logged as administrative correction. Officers accused of excessive initiative vanished. Clerks who noticed patterns they were not meant to see were reassigned or detained. Entire units were purged after victories deemed doctrinally concerning. The Imperium had learned to fear competence almost as much as disobedience. And the people paid for it. I saw the effects ripple down into the hive worlds. Suppression campaigns dragged on, turning cities into open wounds that never healed. Food shortages became common, blamed on logistical complexity rather than leadership paralysis. Riots were crushed with mechanical brutality, yet returned again and again because nothing fundamental changed. The Imperium responded not by solving problems, but by adding more layers of control, more oversight, more audits, more distrust. The shadow of that erased being lay across everything. Even without a name, its absence shaped policy. Every time a decision was delayed, every time a council overruled a commander to avoid decisive action, I saw the echo. Fear of repetition had become more powerful than fear of failure. I began to recognize the pattern elsewhere too. Inquisitorial investigations that never concluded. Prison systems designed to hold suspects indefinitely rather than resolve guilt. Manufactorums optimized to prevent deviation rather than improve output. The Imperium was no longer trying to win. It was trying not to repeat a mistake it refused to name. Paranoia proved contagious. I felt it in myself. I stopped trusting my own memories, relying instead on revised texts, even when I knew they were incomplete. I avoided forming opinions, preferring sanctioned summaries. When I dreamed of corridors branching endlessly, each door requiring approval from another door before it could open. I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth and the certainty that hesitation had become instinct. One cycle, I was present when an officer was executed for following orders too efficiently. The report accused him of preemptive interpretation. His unit had achieved victory ahead of schedule, disrupting coordination with adjacent forces. The success caused confusion higher up the chain, and confusion demanded punishment. His execution was quiet, witnessed only by officials who understood the message. Do not be faster than the system. Do not be clearer than doctrine. The Imperium had inverted its values. Where once loyalty meant acting decisively in its name, now loyalty meant restraint. Where once victory was celebrated, now it was scrutinized for dangerous implications. The system had trained itself to survive by mediocrity, because mediocrity posed no existential threat to its structure. I wrote a report that cycle I will never forget. It summarized a failed suppression campaign that lasted 8 years, consumed millions of lives, and achieved partial compliance at best. The conclusion read, outcome within acceptable parameters. Structural integrity maintained. The Imperium was intact, therefore the cost was justified. That was the final logic of distrust. Survival of the system outweighed the survival of its people. Trust had been deemed too expensive. As I sealed the report, my hands shaking despite myself, I understood the final cruelty of it all. The erased being had not been feared because it was disloyal. It had been feared because it proved the Imperium could act cleanly, decisively, without drowning itself in bureaucracy. That possibility was more dangerous than any enemy. The cost of distrust was not merely inefficiency or cruelty. It was stagnation. An empire too afraid to trust its own strength would rot from the inside, grinding itself down in the name of safety. And I was part of that process now. Another clerk ensuring the machine kept turning, slower and bloodier with every cycle. By the time I realized this, it was already too late to matter. I am not writing this to be believed. Belief requires trust, and trust is the first thing the Imperium teaches you to abandon. I write because confession is the last function left to me, and even that will be misfiled, diluted, or erased once my designation expires. This record will be sealed, my access revoked, my name reduced to a clerical anomaly, a checksum error in a system too large to care. The signs were there before the end came for me personally. They always are. My clearance renewals began to lag. Self-assessment reviews returned with neutral acknowledgements instead of approvals. Inspectors stopped questioning me directly and began speaking around me, as if my presence were already being accounted for in past tense. In the Imperium, when authority stops watching you closely, it means a decision has already been made. I was summoned to the consolidation wing one final time. The chamber was colder than I remembered, its lumen glow dimmed to preservation levels. A single slate waited on the table, already active. No overseer stood with it, no inspector asked questions. That alone told me everything. I was no longer a variable, I was an outcome. The directive was simple: finalize personal testimony review. My own work, my own records, my own memory. I was instructed to verify that my past reports, annotations, and access logs aligned fully with revised doctrine. Where discrepancies appeared, I was to mark them as error, clerical drift, misinterpretation, unauthorized inference. In effect, I was being asked to erase myself in the same way I had erased the truth. I complied. Line by line, I corrected my own history. Doubts were reclassified as procedural curiosity. Concerns were reframed as misunderstanding. Moments of insight were flattened into compliance. Each confirmation felt like driving a nail through something living, but I felt no resistance anymore. Only fatigue. When I finished, the slate chimed softly. Reiko Igiend. No commendation followed, no dismissal, just a final notice appended to my designation: access to high-risk doctrinal material terminated. Reassignment pending. Reassignment is mercy, by Imperial standards. It means you will continue to be useful in a capacity that cannot threaten structure. Labor roles, menial processing, sometimes quiet detention framed as reeducation. The details no longer mattered. My function as a witness was complete. As I left the consolidation wing, I passed a junior clerk entering for the first time. Their uniform was crisp, their eyes alert with the kind of ignorance that still believes order equals purpose. They nodded respectfully. I did not return it. Not out of cruelty, but because acknowledgement implies continuity. And I knew then that I was already being severed. This is what I understand now. In the quiet moments before reassignment becomes disappearance, some creations are too powerful to be loved, too effective to be trusted, too useful to be destroyed. So the Imperium does what it always does with such things. It binds them, watches them, then buries them under doctrine until even their shadow is classified. Distrust becomes compromise, compromise becomes law, law becomes habit, and habit becomes destiny. The unnamed being was not erased because it failed. It was erased because it revealed a truth the Imperium could not survive admitting: that decisive authority works, and that the layers of fear-built bureaucracy are not protection but restraint. The Imperium did not fear rebellion. It feared clarity. I am proof of that. I did not rebel. I did not defy orders. I did not even speak the forbidden name. I only understood, and understanding in this empire is the final transgression. This confession will be archived automatically once I submit it. It will be sealed behind permissions no one will request. In time, it will degrade, corrupted by system updates and neglect, until it becomes unreadable noise. That is how the Imperium ensures survival, not by destroying truth, but by outlasting it. If this survives at all, it will be by mistake. And if you are reading this, then know this: the Imperium did not lose trust because it was betrayed. It lost trust because it learned too much about itself. That knowledge was unbearable. So it buried it, with me.